Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at what is oligarchy. Now, etymologically, oligarchy means rule of the few. In its simplest form, it is contrasted with democracy, rule of the many, monarchy, rule of the one, and anarchy, rule of none. We might consider any society where power is concentrated in the hands of a few to be some type of oligarchy. Even with this basic definition, we can see that oligarchies will be matters of degree. How concentrated is the power? How many people make up the few? You could even imagine that representative democracies could be considered a type of oligarchy, because even if the representatives are acting with the justification of the people, with the people's blessing, they are still a few, a smaller group, a minority that are ruling over others. However, this is probably an overly general definition that is going to capture a few too many societies than we really are thinking of when we're talking about oligarchies. Within philosophy and political science, the term often has a more specific meaning that we're going to explore today. In this video, we're going to explore that definition. We're going to look at whether oligarchies are good or not, and look at whether it can be applied to modern societies such as the US. Is America an oligarchy? So, the idea of an oligarchy can be traced back to Aristotle, who offers a more nuanced definition than just rule of the few. Aristotle connects oligarchy to rule of the wealthy, or a kind of perverted rule of the few. And for many years, an oligarchy was considered a society that was ruled by the wealthy few. Though some philosophers, especially in the 20th century, identified oligarchs with the elite, very generally a minority group in power, regardless of whether it was wealth or something else that put there. We'll talk about the difference between oligarchs and elite in a moment. For now, understand Aristotle generally is considered to have been talking about rule of the wealthy few. So, Aristotle famously, within his Ethics, viewed virtue as moderation between two extreme vices. In the case of government systems, one of his views on democracy and oligarchy was that these are, in some ways, two extreme vices, and a preferable system of government is somewhere in between. If democracy is rule of the poor many, and oligarchy is rule of the rich few, these two theories are always going to be in tension. And either system is going to lead to the group in power, the majority or the minority, overexploiting the group out of power. For Aristotle, a proper system of government should provide neither power only to the wealthy or equal power to all, but rather to those a power to those that are good and virtuous who contribute to society. Sometimes this is understood as rule of the virtuous. Sometimes this is understood as rule of the middle class or the aristocracy, etc. Now, one might have a range of concerns with Aristotle, such as who gets to determine who counts as good people in society and what counts as contributing, what makes one part of the group deserving of power. But he does provide us with the idea that democracy and oligarchy exist on a spectrum and in some amount of tension with each other. In few societies do the wealthy have no political power at all. Generally, the wealthy people have slightly more power over politics than the poor do, even in the most egalitarian of democracies. But similarly, in few societies do the poor masses have absolutely zero power, even that is if that's only the power to revolt, cause a revolution, or just strike. This means that the question is less whether a country is a democracy or an oligarchy, and more how much of an oligarchy or a democracy is a society. So, getting back to the question we mentioned earlier on elites versus oligarchs. At various points in time, some theorists have made a distinction between oligarchs and elites. At other points in time, the two terms are conflated and considered synonymous. When a distinction is made, oligarchs are identified as those that have political power in virtue of their wealth, while elites are those that have political power in virtue of something else. Maybe that's popular support. Maybe that's military control. Maybe that's foreign backing, membership in a ruling party, membership in a particularly powerful religion, etc. Oligarchs, when distinguished from elites, are also unique because they have such similar sources of power that their interests are often aligned. Because oligarchs, when we're just talking about people that have political power because of their wealth, are ruling a society, they often all have similar interests. They want strong property rights, they want low taxes, etc. They want to make sure the poor can't steal from them, they want to make sure that the poor can't tax them, and that they don't have any legal liabilities, things like that. And they're more generally understood elites, on the other hand, when we think of, if we conflate the terms oligarchs and elites and we say oligarchy is just kind of the rule of the elites, it's harder to define that within a political system because the elites may have competing interests and so may not be as united as oligarchs are over these kind of ideas of stronger property rights and lower taxes. And therefore maybe struggle just as general elites to exist as a coordinated, united ruling group in a way that oligarchs are. Now, there are a range of varieties of oligarchies that have been documented over time. Warring oligarchs are those oligarchs that are fully armed and in active conflict with each other where none have full political control. Gangs, mafias, warlords are common examples of these types of oligarchic systems. Ruling oligarchies, on the other hand, are those that may be in competition but work together to fund or support a common military force used to enforce their property rights, though they may also have private militaries. It's important to note that ruling oligarchies are situations where the oligarchs themselves are the rulers of the society. Maybe there are different houses or communities that work together to families that work together to rule over the society collectively. And they may have certain amounts of individual militaries as well as work together for the collective power of enforcing their property rights, ensuring the poor don't rise up, things like that. Ancient Rome might be categorized as such a system. If elites are considered oligarchs, regardless of the source of their power, so if we take a step back from the specific definition of oligarchs as just those that gain political power through wealth, and we're talking generally about elites, we might consider the USSR, early communist China, to be considered oligarchies, as they were ruled by the elites, but they had power through connection to the party system, not through wealth, though these countries have become more capitalist and have therefore gained their own set of wealth-based oligarchs. Now, sultanistic oligarchies, on the other hand, are those where a single oligarch rules over other oligarchs, but also reinforces the power of those other oligarchs. Systems of Iran and Saudi Arabia could be described as such a system, though many other systems could fall into this category. It's important to note that just like democracy can also exist on a spectrum with oligarchy, things like theocracy can exist on a spectrum with oligarchy as well. You can have a rich few that are in power who claim that their power is derived from God, when in fact their power is derived from their wealth. Civil oligarchies, on the other hand, are those systems where oligarchs do not rule directly, but rather use the power and influence that their wealth affords them to influence politics and to enact laws that defend their own wealth from taxes, lawsuits, and theft by the poor. Civil oligarchies are the most likely to be on a spectrum with democracy, as the level of influence that oligarchs have is a sliding scale. And we'll talk more about civil oligarchies soon. So, we can also think of oligarchies in terms of different dimensions. How many oligarchs are there? Is this just a group of 6 people, maybe the heads of powerful families that are ruling over a country or a community? Or is it an entire class of hundreds and hundreds of people that have a certain amount of wealth that they've gained to be able to influence power in politics? Does power scale with wealth? I.e., those in the middle class have some political power, more than the poor, but not that much. Those in the upper class have more political power. The uber wealthy have the most political power. We could imagine this as through the ability to give campaign donations. The more money you have, the more you can give to a campaign. Therefore, the more political power you have over what those politicians do. And so we're scaling that. Those with the most wealth have the most power, but still people further down the line have some power. Or conversely, is there a cutoff above which to have power? You have to be above that cutoff to have power, below which you don't. If you, for example, can buy a lobbyist or maybe a seat at a table, you can have a say, but if not, you don't have any say at all. So is this a sliding scale, or is it a cutoff of this elite group has power because of their wealth? Others, even if they have just a little bit less wealth, maybe don't have any power at all. Can groups of poor people band together to access the power similar to an oligarch through things like labor unions, nonprofits, grassroots political action committees, or not? Is this kind of a closed-off system, or can groups of poor people get together and have a similar say in politics by banding together, putting their money towards a political action community, a labor union, etc., buying their own lobbyists, buying their own levers on power? Or is it a closed-off system where no matter how much the poor organize, they're going to be shut out of the doors of power? Now, okay, so we've looked at several different types of oligarchies. A key philosophical question to turn to now is whether oligarchies are good. Are they just? Are they good systems of government? And if so, what level of an oligarchy is good? Speaking to the varieties, I expect few would champion warring oligarchies as morally good due to the many that die under them. Few people in war zones who are under different warlords that are fighting for control probably think theirs is the best form of government. Now, ruling oligarchies and sultanistic oligarchies face another type of challenge, the question of in virtue of what do the leaders of these groups have the moral right to rule? Without some other theory like theocracy or divinely anointed monarchy on top of the oligarchy, it's hard to justify how money gives someone the right to have complete control over government, to be the permanent head of state. There are practical reasons we might think these systems are preferable to a monarchy, for example. From a small r republicanism perspective, there are more checks and balances on power when you have a group of oligarchs who can balance each other's power out. Or more preferable to anarchy, there's less violence and death. Maybe they're more preferable to warring oligarchies where there's a lot more actual physical fighting, there's a lot more peace in a ruling oligarchy or sultanistic oligarchy. But are they morally superior to a democracy? I think few would make that argument. Now, this leaves us with the question of civil oligarchs, who do not have complete control over a society. They aren't the permanent heads of state in a society, but they do have more control than a complete democracy due to their wealth, allowing them some amount of political control. What are some possible justifications for such a system? Aristotle clearly thought that we need at least a little bit of oligarchy going on here. Now, there are several kind of capitalist rationales for providing oligarchs with more power. If redistribution gets too out of hand, it can limit businesses, job creation, and economic growth. The owners of capital will be fewer than the labor force, but they have competing interests, and so they need a bigger voice in politics to balance that out. A good political system would provide just enough power to allow the oligarchs to continue to support economic growth while not capturing power so much as to compound their wealth through enacting policies that increase inequality. However, even the capitalist might urge real substantial limits to the power of such oligarchs, as they can warp the market through monopoly and oligopoly, the kinds of problems that are only addressed through the state, and if they control the power of the state, they may be able to cement their monopolies or oligopolies. If they're able to capture government, they may not only act to preserve their own wealth and businesses, but also to crush competition, which is a good thing in terms of market forces from the capitalist perspective, preventing new business formation through regulations that only sufficiently large companies can comply with. They're the only sufficiently large companies around, and so they're able to maintain their monopoly or oligopoly over a market. And they do this because any new oligarchs would diminish their own power, would cut into their profit margins, etc. This can lead to stagnation, eventual economic decline. A political system would need to be able to put limits on the ability of those with money to influence the policies and narratives to prevent runaway inequality that eventually limits growth. A proportional oligarchy, where even the middle class can influence politics through contributions, might do something to correct this if there were sufficient limits on it, but only if the inequality was not already so great that the power of a few oligarchs could completely wash out any contributions of the many poor and the middle class. Now, others might make a moral case here, arguing that everyone should have an equal voice in politics, period. One might claim that many in the labor force are uniquely positioned to determine policies that would positively impact their lives, including policies over businesses and corporations and those in power, and claiming that the oligarchs hold some privileged position to determine what is good for society is infantilizing to the vast majority of the population. In fact, one might argue that the pervasiveness of such narratives is evidence for the existence of an oligarchy in our society, as only oligarchs own media companies, and they have an incentive to convince the population that oligarchs are in fact good for society and therefore deserve a greater voice. For more on kind of this narrative of and how the science of economics tries to justify the claim that the preferences of the rich simply matter more than the preferences of the poor, check out our book, Are All Lives Equal? Now, this brings us to a key question. Is America an oligarchy? If it is any type of oligarchy, it seems to be a civil one. though there are maybe smaller warring oligarchies such as gangs operating at a lower level. At a federal level, America doesn't seem to be a warring oligarchy. It doesn't seem to be a ruling oligarchy because the oligarchs are not in permanent positions of power within the government. There is turnover. There are elections that happen. It'd be challenging to defend the claim that the oligarchs are the permanent heads of government, given that politicians continue to be elected instead of just appointed by the rich. And so this is not a ruling or a sultanistic oligarchy. Though there is a strong case that oligarchs exert indirect control over politics through things like campaign donations. Let's talk through that. So, this said, I think it would be hard to defend the claim that America is fully a democracy on Aristotle's scale between oligarchy and democracy, where the wealthy have absolutely zero influence on politics. If anything, it may be somewhere close to the middle, if not leaning more towards oligarchy, though these are things that are hard to measure objectively. There are many signs that America is making progress to become more and more of an oligarchy, though, from wherever it started. Remember that a key feature of a civil oligarchy is the oligarchs using their wealth to manipulate the state to further protect and entrench that wealth. The lowering of the tax rate on highest earners is a key feature of this. In 1944, for example, the top tax bracket was at 94%. It remained over 90% until the mid-1960s. The corporate tax rate was over 50%. This coincides with a point in time where wealth was much less concentrated in the hands of the rich. Over the last 50 years, the tax rate has dropped to just 37% for the top earners and 21% for corporations, and wealth inequality has increased substantially. And that's nothing to say about all the loopholes that the uber-rich can use to simply take loans against their wealth to avoid income tax at all. The only substantial policy bill that the last Republican administration passed was one lowering the tax rate for the uber-rich. This is likely the only major bill they will pass in the current administration as well. This is an indication that oligarchs do have significant influence over political leaders and significant influence over politics, and they're able to use that influence to entrench their wealth and prevent a political system from taxing them, from giving the poor more power and more control over that wealth. So, is America an oligarchy? Yes, at least somewhat, but it's a civil oligarchy. And it doesn't mean it isn't also a democracy, just that it exists somewhere on the spectrum between a democracy and an oligarchy. The few in America certainly have a lot of power, and they do have the ability to influence politics. But the poor also have power, and they have the ability to influence politics as well. The more influence the oligarchs have over politics to consolidate their power, the less we remain a democracy, and the more we become an oligarchy. What do you think? Should we define an oligarchy as the rule of any set of elites, or just the wealthy few whose power derives from their wealth? What are examples you know of warring, ruling, sultanistic, and civil oligarchies? Where does your country fit on the scale from democracy to oligarchy? Is some amount of oligarchy a good thing, and we need it to balance out a straight democracy? How much is the right amount of oligarchy? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.